How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so I'm sure that practically everybody has heard of the name Socrates. And even if they don't know anything about what he's reported to have said or believed, they probably know this one fact. They know that he was sentenced to death by hemlock by his fellow Athenians in 399 BC. It's hard to escape this major event. In fact, outside of the trial and death of Jesus, no death has been discussed more. In the last 2,400 years, no death has been more iconic. Okay, but why has it had such an impact on us? And why should it be appreciated as important? Well, I just want to explore a couple of things. One a little more obvious, and the other slightly less so, but in my opinion, still interesting and possibly instructive for all of us. Okay, so the first thing I want to say something about has to do with what it was Socrates was willing to die for. But for that, we need to back up a bit and get some context. So Socrates was charged with two things. Charged, by the way, by a democratic government. He was charged with religious unorthodoxy and with corrupting the youth. Now, I don't want to get into the forensics of these charges because it does get detailed. And there are different sides or perceptions at play. But by and large, I think it's safe to conclude that Socrates was basically misunderstood and unjustly sent to prison and eventually sentenced to death. Okay, but it's in his prison cell awaiting his death that I want to focus in on here. And that's because Socrates could have escaped with the help of his friends, but he chose not to. The option was completely open to him without much risk at all, actually. He could have gone on to live in exile for the remainder of his life, and he could have done this in tranquility and comfort, enjoying his old age. But again, he chose not to. He chose to die instead. So the question is, why? Well, the short answer is that he wanted to stay true to his convictions, and doing this was far more valuable than life itself. More specifically, doing philosophy, which came down to examining himself and others with the goal of realizing truth and virtue, this was more important than death. So, as Socrates himself says, if given the choice between staying alive but not philosophizing, or being sentenced to death, he'll take death, no question. The unexamined life is truly not worth living. He spent his whole adult life in search of wisdom and virtue, and he's not going to stop now simply because he's threatened by the authorities to do so. And he doesn't budge on this at all. No, as Plato describes it, he goes right on philosophizing and searching until his very last breath, until the hemlock he voluntarily drinks takes its full effect. So notice something very important in all of this then. Notice that Socrates lived and died without any hypocrisy or inconsistency. He never lived in such a way where he was out of tune with himself. There was a complete integration between his life and his death. He chose to die because of what he'd always believed in. He wasn't willing to sell out, so to speak. That's to say, he wasn't prepared to do something he thought wasn't right just because he could go on living a few more years. Now, this is one reason why his death is so important and admirable. Certainly, this is why the French philosophe Diderot admired him. For Diderot, Socrates was a model of integrity because he was able to manufacture or create a death that was in total accordance with the essential principles of his life. Now, how many of us have it in us to live and die this way? Anyway, before I move on to the second reason why I think it is Socrates' death is so significant or interesting, I just want to mention one more thing. I just want to really emphasize how strong and single-minded Socrates was in sticking to his mission and what it is he believed. I mean, his life ended the way it did because he questioned authority and traditional morality by following his own conscience. This is in part why the later German philosopher Hegel admired him. He said that Socrates was hugely important in world history because he was one of the first people, by resisting Athens, to introduce the idea that as individuals we must decide what we think is right for ourselves and not just conform to the wisdom handed down to us by past or previous generations. Okay, well, now, as mentioned, let me focus on another important aspect of Socrates' death. So, according to Plato, in his dialogue, the Phaedo, Socrates faces his last few hours and his death with complete equanimity. I mean, he's laughing and joking with his friends. And then he grabs the hemlock from the executioner in a cheerful manner, without a tremor of change of expression. And then he drains the cup calmly and easily. So notice something. Notice that there is no evidence here, no physical symptoms that he fears death at all. So what's going on then? How is this possible? Well, maybe, as the philosopher Bertrand Russell suggests, it's because Socrates believes in an afterlife. In other words, the claim is that Socrates believes firmly in the reality of immortality. And so that's why he's not afraid of death. As Russell says, this would explain his calm and his smugness in the face of death. It's because he knows that he's about to enjoy eternal bliss that he acts with such equanimity. This is why Russell says that Socrates is actually not that courageous when you think about it. He'd be much more courageous if he died without the reassuring belief in immortality. In other words, faith makes things a little easier. The faithful don't require the kind of real courage that belong to the faithless, Russell seems to be suggesting. Okay, but is Russell right about Socrates here? Well, it's certainly true that Socrates spends a considerable amount of time trying to put forward arguments for the immortality of the soul. But the thing is that it's not entirely clear that he believes them or that he thinks they offer up decisive proof. So the bottom line is that he's just not sure. So Russell seems to be overstating his case here. Socrates isn't the firm believer that Russell takes him to be, and therefore it's not really true that he's not that courageous in the face of death. No, what's more accurate to say is that Socrates, despite his arguments, is actually still unsure about any form of immortality. And so, well, that makes his equanimity and his courage, and for that matter, his willingness to drink the hemlock, all that more interesting and substantial. Okay, well, so what's one possible answer or explanation here? Well, it's that Socrates is ultimately ignorant, and that's precisely why he's not afraid of death. After all, he basically says it himself. He says this, he says, "To fear death is to think oneself wise when one is not." In other words, it's because he doesn't know either way about what happens after death that he doesn't really fear it. It's because he's agnostic and open that he's not broken or defeated by the prospect of death. I think maybe another way of saying all this is that Socrates is incessantly curious, and that includes being curious about death, about what happens next, if anything. So he never stops wondering, And this is what drives him even right through to the end, and maybe even past this life. Who knows? Now, this is the true philosopher. As Aristotle says, philosophy begins with wonder. And that's Socrates to a T. For him, everything is open for questioning and exploration. And with that sort of attitude or spirit, there simply is no room for despair, for the simple fact that despair is often the result of certainty and dogmatism. Actually, you know what? This sort of open attitude reminds me a bit of something the English romantic poet John Keats called negative capability. Now, this might sound like a bit of a mouthful, but he says that negative capability is when the poet is capable of being in uncertainties and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Now, in broad strokes, I think that what Keats is saying is that negative capability is something like the ideal capacity of the poet to remain open and receptive to the world. A capacity for stepping out of the way of oneself and one's established beliefs and biases in order to allow oneself to be impressed upon and moved by things. So an important part of this would mean not relating to things in the world by always trying to pin them down or attain objective knowledge of them. But notice something. Notice that what this open, non-imposing way of relating to the world means is allowing in and being comfortable with a fair amount of uncertainty and indeterminacy and outside influence. It means letting the world present itself as it is in all of its mystery and power and to be susceptible to that. Now, I don't want to press this comparison too hard because I don't think it would be that accurate. But I think we can see something of this in Socrates' approach to his death. And it's what helps to make sense of his cheerful demeanor despite the circumstances. What is it? Well, it's the cultivation of wonder, not certainty, in the face of his death that explains his somewhat playful and curious attitude. An attitude we'd all perhaps do well to have when our own time comes. Okay, well, so I think there's another related aspect to what I've been saying so far about Socrates and the way that he dies that's relevant here. And for this, we need to say something about another great martyr, someone who appears on the scene 400 years later or so. You know that little Jewish prophet called Yeshua, otherwise known as Jesus Christ, of course. So the parallels between these two great figures is well known. For example, they both preached turning the other cheek. They both were ridiculed and humiliated. And they both submitted to death, each for a higher principle or cause. But similarities aside, there is one enormous difference between them. It's that while Socrates died painlessly and calmly, Jesus suffered and died in agony. I mean, as Mark and Matthew make clear, Jesus is sorrowful and he's troubled. And then, of course, we have the pain and humiliation of the man on the cross. Now, many have claimed that it's precisely the fact that Jesus suffers that makes his death more admirable than Socrates's. For example, the church leader, Tertullian, says that, and here his target is clearly Socrates, he says that a Christian martyr tastes death not out of a cup, almost in the way of jollity, but it exhausts in every kind of bitter cruelty. So, in other words, what he's saying is basically that Socrates knows nothing about death because he didn't suffer properly, because he had it much too easy by not dying in agony on the cross like Christ. Only if you die in pain and in silence do you die heroically. Okay, but why should this be the case? As the French philosopher Montaigne said, it's actually because Socrates made his death become something seemingly pleasurable and easy that it's a sign of great virtue on his part. And so for this reason, extremely admirable. A model of emulation, in fact. Actually, here I'm reminded of a quote from Nietzsche, who, by the way, also sides with Socrates over Christ. He said this, he said, "Socrates excels the founder of Christianity in his cheery earnestness and his prankish wisdom. Besides, he was smarter." Anyway, so given everything I've said here, here's a final question we might want to consider. Namely, what would have happened if Socrates just simply died at home in his sleep? What would our intellectual or moral history have looked like? Would our ideas of truth and integrity and heroicism looked different without that image we have of that iconic death that Plato left us with? Well, my answer is absolutely. Bye for now.